From the birth of partition in 1921 to the fall of Stormont in 1972, 6 men held the post of Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. All were leaders of unionism, each personified a particular role as Prime Minister. From Craig, the state builder, Andrews, the ageing caretaker, Brooke, the loyalist squire, O'Neill, the aristocratic reformer, Chichester Clark, the dutiful officer, to Faulkner, the pragmatic hardliner. Unionists in Northern Ireland have had mixed feelings about these men, ranging from deep reverence through ambivalence to contempt. On the other hand, Northern nationalists have, on the whole, regarded them all as the unlovely embodiment of a deeply detested regime. But who were these 6 partly forgotten and still divisive leaders? For most of the people of Northern Ireland, whatever their political choices, these remain largely unknown figures. My name is Alvin Jackson. As an historian, I've written and lectured on Ireland, and Northern Ireland in particular, for over 30 years. In this series, I'm going to reveal the stories of these 6 men who, for better or worse, have left their indelible mark on the North's troubled history. I'm going to reveal the critical moments that defined their time in office, and I'll examine the decisions that they made that shaped the history of Northern Ireland throughout the 20th century. For over 90 years, Parliament buildings at Stormont have been at the centre of politics and power in Northern Ireland. While the statue of Edward Carson defiantly stands sentinel outside, this Parliament building was created under the eye of the first Prime Minister, Sir James Craig. This was the house that Craig built. Regarded by Unionists as the founding father of Northern Ireland, and by nationalists as the architect of the loathed partition, his enduring legacy still casts a long shadow over this place. But who was the man who became the first Prime Minister of Northern Ireland? James Craig was born in 1871 in the Sydenham area of East Belfast, the 7th child of a self-made man. His father, James Sr., grafted his way up from a clerk in a whisky distillery to become a millionaire partner in the firm. With the family having a Scottish ancestry, he was educated in Edinburgh, and inheriting his father's determination, Craig opened his own stockbroking firm in Belfast.
Morning, Alvin. Welcome to Craig Alvin House.
Hi, Carol. Thank you so much for opening this dramatic house for us today. This is the first time that I've been inside Craig Alvin House, and my goodness, it has an impact. This is a house built to impress.
It is, and built to last as well, and no expense was spared on it. As you said, it was the best of everything was put into it. The Craig family made their money in Dunville's whisky, and at the height of industrial Belfast, Dunville's was exporting 2.5 million gallons of whisky. So there was a lot of money being made in whisky, and James Craig Sr. invested that money into Craig Alvin House.
The Craig family were major players in Belfast's merchant class at a time when the city was an industrial powerhouse of the British Empire. In 1900, Craig enlisted in the Irish Rifles, later the Imperial Yeomanry, and he set sail for South Africa to fight with the British forces in the Second Boer War. Craig thought that he was leaving behind a world of bookkeeping and finance in search of romance and adventure. But the reality in South Africa would be very different. In what was a bitter colonial war, Craig was captured by the Boers. Injured and weakened, he was forced to march in the searing African heat to a prison camp alongside his men. Craig's fight for the defence of the British Empire was a defining experience that shaped his political rise following his return to Ireland, as he emerged after 1910 as the organising power behind unionism's charismatic leader, Edward Carson. Home Rule, a form of limited self-government for Ireland which had been sought by Irish nationalists, had overshadowed British politics for decades. Nowhere was resistance stronger than in Ulster, where Unionists saw it as a threat to their place in the empire. With his keen eye for the power of the press and propaganda, it was Craig who orchestrated the centrepiece of Unionist opposition, the signing of the Ulster Covenant on the 28th of September 1912 in Belfast City Hall. Carson was the star turn. Craig, however, was the impresario and stage manager. The First World War suspended Home Rule, averting a likely civil war in Ireland. Desperate to resolve the issue after the war, in 1920 the British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, launched a plan for the partitioning of Ireland and the creation of two states, Southern and Northern Ireland. Yet this was an imperfect solution. Both new territories included people who felt they were on the wrong side of the border. Over 1/3 of the population of Northern Ireland were Catholic nationalists who saw themselves placed under the control of their long-term political opponents, and their alienation would in turn be a major challenge for the leaders of unionism. Who then was to be Prime Minister of this new Northern Ireland? Carson was ailing and ageing, and attention therefore turned to James Craig, and Craig seized his moment. For the first time, the master tactician who had worked in Carson's shadow, now in 1921, stepped into the spotlight to become leader of the new devolved government in Northern Ireland. Craig's wife Cecile was well connected and politically active. Together they made a formidable and powerful couple. Craig's hastily assembled cabinet commandeered Belfast's Presbyterian Theological College as its temporary home, while he took up office in Stormont Castle. He moved swiftly to establish the apparatus of his new state, as it took shape against the backdrop of the Irish War of Independence and corresponding loyalist violence. The IRA campaign was now spreading into the north, and Belfast was becoming a battle zone. Catholics and nationalists bore the clear brunt of casualties in the city, while in South Ulster the IRA was ratcheting up its attacks on loyalists and on the Crown forces. In James Craig's eyes, Northern Ireland was being threatened from every direction. Attacks against Catholics and nationalists were orchestrated by loyalist vigilantes and paramilitaries, as well as by some members of the Crown forces, including from within the Ulster Special Constabulary, founded in 1920. The IRA campaign was eventually masterminded by Michael Collins, the leader of the new Irish Provisional Government. Under pressure from London to broker peace, and at some personal risk, Craig engaged in a series of talks with Collins in early 1922, designed to ease IRA pressure in the north and to help Catholics, but these ultimately failed. Craig imposed extreme security measures to deal with those whom he saw as enemies within, the nationalist minority who did not recognise Northern Ireland. He rushed through a Special Powers Act in 1922, permitting suspects to be interned without trial. Craig also tightened unionist control over local government, axing proportional representation in council elections, and approving new local boundaries to ensure a unionist majority. These decisions created a deep and a lasting sense of injustice amongst the nationalist minority. Craig's priority in the 1920s was the establishment of his unionist state, seeing off its enemies and establishing its borders. Nationalists simply didn't feature amongst his concerns except as a potential source of challenge and, in his eyes, as disloyalists. Though brutal and controversial, Craig's measures contributed towards seeing off the IRA threat. And by 1925, the final report of the Boundary Commission recommended little change to the border. Indeed, it was suppressed, leaving Northern nationalists now resigned to the reality of a partitioned state. In 1927, Craig was rewarded with a peerage as Lord Craigavon. Five years later, and with the future of his state apparently secure, Craig finally had a home for his parliament. With his forensic eye for detail, Craig had obsessively overseen the construction of Stormont, his crowning glory. Its opening by Edward, Prince of Wales in 1932 sent out a proud and a defiant message to the world. Grand, imposing, highly ornate, built to impress. This is what Craig envisioned as the symbol of his new state. For James Craig, what this said was, Northern Ireland is permanent, we are here to stay. This new home for Craig's Parliament proved a deeply uncomfortable place for Northern nationalists. While Republicans remained abstentionist, nationalist MPs, led by Joe Devlin, reluctantly took their seats in the Parliament from 1925 onwards. Not as an official opposition, but to highlight Catholic grievances. For the nationalist minority, their view of Craig's Northern Ireland as a cold house for Catholics was to be confirmed in 1934 when Craig made a controversial speech in this Parliament. Standing in this building and in response to a question about the Protestant nature of the Unionist-dominated Parliament, Craig said these words. In the South, they boasted of a Catholic state. They still boast of Southern Ireland being a Catholic state. All I boast of is that we are a Protestant Parliament and a Protestant state. Fundamentally, Craig had fought for a unionist mirror image of Catholic Gaelic Ireland. His Northern Ireland wasn't designed to be ecumenical or power-sharing. The speech has marked his reputation with nationalist Ireland for long, and it resonates still today. Marie, what was the reaction of Northern nationalists to Craig's speech?
I think in some ways there was a sense of resignation about Craig's speech, because we should look at the context in which he gave that speech. First of all, we have to deal with the fact that it's often been misquoted. What he said was a Protestant Parliament. We are a Protestant Parliament and a Protestant people. He did not say a Protestant Parliament for a Protestant people, which it has often been received as. In many ways, you could say it was simply a statement of fact. And he also said it in the context of the Irish Free State at the time, seeing itself as a Catholic state for a Catholic majority. I think it's when it's in that wider context of similar speeches made by other members of the Unionist government, that it is not just a one-off, off-the-cuff comment, it's not just a reaction. I think it reinforced everything nationalists thought about the Unionist government being sectarian and bigoted against Catholics and not representing nationalists.
And how do you think nationalists viewed Craig as Prime Minister?
I don't think they ever viewed him as their Prime Minister, and I don't think he ever made any great effort to do so. There's maybe a brief period there when the North was set up, when it looked like he was trying to be a Prime Minister for everyone. But if we go back to that famous speech of April 1934, to take another line from that speech, he talks about how he sees himself as an orange man first and as Prime Minister second. And I think that says a lot, and it would say a lot to nationalist audiences that this man has his priorities, and his priorities are his membership of the Orange Order, his leadership of the Ulster Unionist Party, and his role as Prime Minister of Northern Ireland comes a poor third behind that.
James Craig had guided Northern Ireland through its first decade. But while the IRA's threat had faded by the later 1920s, he now faced other challenges as a global recession, driven by the Wall Street crash, swept the world alongside the rise of fascism in Europe. In Belfast, the economic crisis unified working-class nationalists and unionists who took to the streets in protest in the outdoor relief riots of October 1932. Fearful of an escalation of the disorder, Craig later made a rare broadcast to his people, appealing for calm.
I would like to say that any observer of world conditions must realize that there is an unsettlement.
This is a fascinating piece of film from all sorts of perspectives. It's a really rare example of Craig speaking on film. The voice is much more mellifluous than one would expect, given his craggy features and his tough reputation. A mellifluous voice, an Ulster accent in contradistinction to later Northern Ireland Prime Ministers.
But whatever it may be, there is no doubt that from time to time people are apt to do certain things, to take action which in normal peaceful times they would never dream of.
The substance of what he's saying is also fascinating. The economic condition of Northern Ireland is not essentially his responsibility. The situation is a global one. And the emphasis on law and order, of course, is clear as well. This is an issue which is less about the economy and more about the law and order condition of the North.
We are part of Great Britain. I think I am right in saying we are the most loyal part of Great Britain. And all Ulster men rejoice in the close relationship between the mother country and ourselves.
The turbulent years of state building had come at a cost to James Craig's health. Throughout the 1930s, he spent more time far away from Northern Ireland with his closest confidant, his wife Cecile, as Europe edged towards war.
They spent an increasingly large amount of time outside of Northern Ireland and received some criticism for that. I think it's an indication of ailing health and old age creeping in, but also a sense of perhaps not that their work was over, but was that they'd given so much they perhaps deserved a little time to enjoy themselves. But resignation doesn't seem to have been an option. Craig would not leave that office until Craig made the decision and really not thinking about what might have been right for the party or Northern Ireland more broadly.
Perhaps you would tell us, Diane, what the archive says about Lady Craig as a personality.
She's a fascinating character, but one who's largely been written out of not just Unionist history, but Irish history. And she's left us an amazing collection of diary extracts. And the diaries reveal her as intensely loyal to her spouse, And I think James Craig needs that. She talks about the duty that they have to Ulster as a heavy burden, and that's quite early on. And I don't think she ever moves away from that, but it was this sense of serving, doing what, Craig said he would do, which really does define much of his premiership.
When war broke out in Europe in September 1939, Craig had been in power for over 18 years. With its shipyards and heavy industries, Northern Ireland would be expected to play its part in the war effort. But just over a year later, in November 1940, James Craig, Lord Craigavon, died suddenly at home with his pipe and a detective novel by his side. He was 69.
The death of Lord Craigavon left vacant the office of Prime Minister in Northern Ireland, a position calling for an exceptional man in these difficult days. The man selected to hold the office of Premier was Mr. U.Y.M. Andrews, a man whose policy is unswerving loyalty to the Empire finds inspiration in the Stormont statue of Lord Carson, Ulster's hero.
After years of drift and with the world at war, the new Prime Minister faced a near impossible job. John Miller Andrews was from Cumber, County Down, and was born into a prominent family of mill owners. His brother Thomas had designed Titanic and had perished on its maiden voyage. Like Craig, Andrews was both a veteran of the fight against Home Rule and was deeply rooted in the loyalist heartland of East Ulster. As Minister of Labour under Craig, Andrews had succeeded in ensuring that Northern Ireland had the same level of social welfare benefits as Britain. But at the age of nearly 70, the new Prime Minister's greatest challenge would be managing Northern Ireland's war effort. By 1940, German bombs were raining down upon English cities such as London and Coventry. And it soon became clear that Belfast, with its munition works, its engineering, above all with its shipbuilding, that Belfast would be the next target for the Luftwaffe. In April 1941, the city was hit by a series of deadly raids. It seemed the Northern Ireland government's failure to prepare effectively for the Nazi bombs had left Belfast and its vital industries, so crucial to the British war effort, vulnerable to attack. The raid on the 15th of April was amongst the worst outside London during the entire Blitz, killing nearly 1,000 people. Northern Ireland's new Prime Minister was an early visitor to the scenes of carnage the following morning. Blame for the devastation of April-May 1941 was laid squarely at John Andrews' door. Yet, much of the responsibility, in fact, should have been held by Craig. Andrews' big problem was that he remained in Craig's shadow for far too long. Neither of them ever produced a workable and effective, a detailed plan for the defence of Belfast and Northern Ireland. I've come to the Andrews family church in Cumber to meet his great-grandson.
I mean, there's no doubt that historians have criticised the premiership in terms of being whether Northern Ireland was properly prepared for the Blitz. And I really ought to leave that to historians to argue and judge. John Miller Andrews was very involved in ensuring that the morale was kept up and that Northern Ireland made its full contribution to the war. In fact, in his initial broadcast to Northern Ireland, he said that here in Ulster we were fighting against the tyranny of the Nazis on behalf of all the people of Ireland.
Ulster is the key to the defence of Ireland. To make it neutral would mean handing over that key to Hitler.
And he very much comes across as an Irishman there, and of course his tradition was Irish Unionist.
A neutral Ulster is impossible. We mean to stand by Britain and the empire.
Your great-grandfather served under Craig for many, many years. Would it be too much to say that he remained under Craigavon's shadow?
Craigavon was a great hero of unionism, and in many ways John Miller Andrews had been running the government in the lead up to the war, and he was effectively the acting Prime Minister. Craigavon was often abroad, he suffered ill health. It was quite often left to my great-grandfather to chair cabinet meetings. So he was the natural successor to Craigavon in 1940, and those first years of the war must have been really grueling.
So John Andrews remains, in the eyes of many, the unknown Northern Ireland Prime Minister. Do you think this is a fair assessment?
In many ways, yes, he was the unknown Prime Minister. In terms of his character, there was certainly the work ethic, the attention to detail, no desire for publicity, no attempt at grandstanding. Politics was a duty, really, to secure the foundation of Northern Ireland, which was got off to a very insecure start.
As younger MPs challenged both his leadership and his ageing cabinet, Andrews became increasingly isolated and his hold on power ebbed away. The minutes of Ulster Unionist Party meetings in April-May 1943 reveal that he was forced out of office by backbench dissent. He left the Prime Ministership a gravely disappointed man, an abrupt end to a lifetime of political endeavour. He would hold one final senior office within loyalism before his death, Imperial Grand Master of the Orange Order, and he was laid to rest in the shadow of his family church in Cumber. James and Cecile Craig were interred side by side here at Stormont, the house that he had built. Westminster was always the ultimate authority, but more than any of the other prime ministers, Craig came closest to wielding absolute power. He was the architect of Northern Ireland. He exercised enormous influence within unionism and at Westminster, but he had failed to reach out to nationalists. Both Craig and Andrews knew how to build a political campaign, but not a functioning political community. Both of them knew how to make government work, but not how to build a diverse country. Both of them had been central to the construction of Northern Ireland, but neither of them knew where to take it or what to do with it. In the next episode, these tasks now lay with the two men who next sought to wield power in Northern Ireland.
An Ulsterman does not give way to threats. He is firmly determined to remain part of the United Kingdom, and nothing will shift him.
Captain O'Neill represents himself as the greatest ever Prime Minister of Ulster. This, of course, is utter rubbish and nonsense.
O'Neill made gestures, but for an awful lot of others in the Catholic working class areas, it was too little too late.